The most interesting days of the war as a result of the operations launched by the Ukrainian army. The Russian army is suffering a heavier defeat every day. Ukrainian army won another important victory today. These defeats of the Russian army have caused chaos in the Kremlin. Differences of opinion among Russian leaders are increasing. We have reported all the developments on this issue for you. You can support our team to continue this kind of news. You can use the super thanks button below the video. Let's start if you're ready. The losses of the Russian army in Ukraine are increasing every day. The biggest of these losses was in the Kherson region. Kherson, the largest settlement occupied by Russia, was liberated by the Ukrainian army. Russian troops had to retreat from this region. This event was one of the turning points of the war. The new developments in Kherson have infuriated the Kremlin. In Kherson, the Russian army has fled to the city center but continues to occupy several towns. The Ukrainian army is conducting operations in each of these towns, inflicting damage on the Russian army. These operations have driven the Kremlin crazy because Kherson was very important for Putin after liberating Kherson. The Ukrainian army also gained the psychological upper hand. Experts all over the world are now fully convinced that Ukraine will win this war. This changed the course of the war. And how did this happen? One of the most important things in a war is psychological superiority. When the war between Ukraine and Russia started, everyone thought that it would end very soon because the Russian army said that this war would end in a very short time. Nobody expected that the Ukrainian army would put up such a successful resistance. But President Zelensky motivated his army and his people very well, declaring that he will never run away. Zelensky ordered his soldiers to resist this occupation. These statements made by Zelensky increased the courage of the Ukrainian army. It was thought that the Ukrainian soldiers would die, but Zelensky made a very striking statement and encouraged his army. Zelensky said the Ukrainian army is made up of heroic soldiers. I believe that our soldiers will win this war. Ukrainian soldiers always follow the orders of their commanders. I order them not to die, but to fight and win this war. Zelensky's speech caused great excitement in the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainian army showed a historic resistance and managed to liberate the most important cities occupied by Russia. The whole world started to follow the success of the Ukrainian army. Following the success of the Ukrainian army, Western countries decided to provide more support to Ukraine. The aid sent by Western countries concerned the Russian army. The Ukrainian army started to use modern weapons and began to carry out more effective operations. Russia suffered a heavy defeat in these operations. Russian soldiers were terrified when they realized that everything had changed. Russian soldiers began to surrender and desert the army. This made it easier for the Ukrainian army. Everything changed when the Russian soldiers were sure that they could no longer win this war. All these results were the result of the Ukrainian army gaining psychological superiority. In order to change the situation, Putin commissioned a lot of fake news and claimed that Russia would win this war. One of the lies Putin told was about Kherson. After the Russian army withdrew from the city center in Kherson, Putin made strange statements. He claimed that Russia had the upper hand in many towns in Kherson and that the Russian army was strong in this region. As an example, he showed photos of Russian soldiers in small towns in Kherson. The Ukrainian army managed to liberate many of these towns. All the towns that Putin showed photos of are now under the control of the Ukrainian army. After weeks of fighting, the Ukrainian army has gained a great superiority over Russia. Russian soldiers started to flee from these towns. The Ukrainian Ministry of Defense has shared many reports about the losses of the Russian army. Apart from these reports, it also showed very important videos from the battlefield. According to the data shared by the Ukrainian Defense Ministry, 162,500 Russian soldiers have been killed since the beginning of the war. The Russian army does not have enough personnel to continue the war. The Russian army has a big problem in this regard. On the other hand, the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense shared a video today. The 8th Separate Mountain Assault Battalion of the 10th Separate Mountain Assault Brigade of the Ukrainian Ground Forces destroys tanks of the Russian army. Ukrainian army posted a video of the destruction of Russian tanks on social media. This video shows how anti-tank missile systems destroy tanks of the Russian army. In the video, it is seen that the tanks are almost blown up. The Ukrainian army is having great success, especially in operations against Russian tanks. The Russian army destroyed 3,504 tanks since the beginning of the war. Many of these tanks are destroyed by Javelin rockets, Javelin missiles. One of the most important ammunition of the Ukrainian army are large enough for a soldier to carry alone. However, these missiles are almost as effective as a tank. Moreover, Javelin missiles manage to penetrate the armor of Russian tanks. Ukrainian soldiers carry out strategic operations targeting Russian tanks because the Russian army had to use these tanks to conduct ground operations. Ukrainian soldiers prevent this by destroying Russian tanks. The Ukrainian army carried out operations against all ammunition of the Russian army. The Ukrainian Defense Ministry also shared the results of these operations. According to the ministry, the losses of the Russian army are as follows: 6,810 armored combat vehicles, 2,539 artillery units, 503 multiple launch rocket system 265, air defense systems, 305 fighter jets, 289 helicopters, 2,145 unmanned aerial vehicles, 907 cruise missiles, 18 warships, and 5,394 motor vehicles and fuel tankers. This superiority of the Ukrainian army on the battlefield is growing every day. The Russian army is now unlikely to win this war, especially the recent battles in the Kherson region and the Bakhmut have caused great damage to the Russian army. The Russian army is being disgraced all over the world. Experts emphasize that this major loss of face and the Russian army is very important for world history. The Russian army will not be able to restore its reputation for a long time. This could lead to a complete loss of Russia's political power. This war is changing the international balance. What do you think about the strategic operations carried out by the Ukrainian army? What do you think about the Ukrainian army gaining psychological superiority? What do you think about the huge casualties of the Russian army? Don't forget to share your opinion with us. Follow us for more updates. There are a lot of updates from the Soledar area. Here the Russians managed to push the Ukrainians out of an important settlement and establish control over the high ground. This caused a chain reaction and forced the Ukrainians to step back from multiple positions along the front line. The Russians tried to leverage their success and develop their offensive further, but faced a big problem. The Ukrainian defense line refused to collapse, and here is why. Last time I told you that the Russians established control over Yakovlevka, which facilitated Russian attacks on Soledar and other settlements on the line. The Ukrainians tried to retake the settlement. However, even though they entered the village, they did not manage to push the Russians out completely. The Russians established their positions and were able to wait until the reinforcements arrived. If we look at the topographic map, we can see that Yakovlevka stands right above Soledar and other settlements in the region. The Ukrainians decided that retaking this high ground position would cost more lives than if they just stepped back. However, this decision required the Ukrainians to make other structural changes to their defensive line. Previously, the Ukrainian defense line went through Yakovlevka, the gypsum formations and factory Kunov in Soledar, and a local school in Bakhmutka. So whenever the Russians tried to attack Soledar from the north, these attacks were counted from Yakovlevka. However, with Yakovlevka under their control, the residential area between the industrial areas became very vulnerable to attacks from the north. Holding the Russians off from one side was a difficult enough task. So with the attacks from the flank, the Ukrainians needed to step back, but they could not just retreat because this would give too much room for the Russians in the center to finally cut off Bakhmut from the mainland. That is why the Ukrainians were forced to start retreating from their positions all the way from Bakhmut Square. Around a week ago, geolocated footage confirmed that Wagner forces entered the local school in Bakhmutka. Soon after that, the Ukrainians left Bakhmut Square almost completely. The Ukrainians are still controlling the warehouses because they are pretty much on the outskirts, and it is still possible to supply this group. Overall, the loss of Yakovlevka made the Ukrainians lose around 1 kilometer of the ground in Soledar and Bakhmut Square. This is the first time in a very long time that the Russians generated gains by using tactics rather than brute force. So they were trying to develop their success in Soledar as much as possible. However, this is where good news for the Russians ended as the Ukrainians stepped back from the outskirts and created a buffer zone. The next Russian target inevitably became the central part of Soledar, and here the Ukrainians have a very formidable defense. First of all, there is a salt mine with a lot of underground passages that the Ukrainians use as an ammunition depot. These passages are so diverse and developed that the Ukrainians can store enormous amounts of supplies which the Russians can in no way destroy because they are too deep underground. Secondly, there is a residential area with a lot of tall buildings that allow monitoring of the land far ahead. The residential area itself is located at an altitude of around 155 meters, while the fields are at around 180 meters. 10-story buildings are usually more than 30 meters tall, which means that the Ukrainians control the hills from above, and the Russians don't have a strong element of surprise. And lastly, even if the fighters reach this area, it is full of industrial zones, which are extremely well fortified. The Russians have been storming Soledar since summer, so the Ukrainians have definitely fortified their positions inside the town. That is why even Russian analysts agree that solidarity is nowhere near falling. Russian analysts also agree that the next target is actually Rostovka, and this is exactly where the Russians have been conducting a lot of combat reconnaissance lately. If you look at the topographic map, we can see that by launching their attacks in this direction, the Russians leverage the geography by hiding behind the hills and preventing a crossfire. But topography is not everything. As you can see, the Ukrainians control the railway embankment, which proved to be in this war harder to cross than some villages. On top of that, even though the Russians avoid crossfire from Soledar, the Ukrainians still have multiple positions along the tree belts and the high ground between Rizivka and Vmka that allow them to count the Russian advances over. All the fighting in this area is expected to remain positional. The Russians indeed managed to increase the area under their control, but there happened to be too many natural obstacles and fortified positions down the line to generate a breakthrough and collapse the front line. Also, the fact that the Russians started relocating Wagner forces from here to defend Kremlin signals that the Russians do not plan to develop their offensive operation on Soledar in the near future, and the Ukrainian defense line is relatively safe. Russia, which has the second largest navy in the world, is about to lose this title with the Ukraine war. It should be noted that if a warship is newly built, it can be procured within 3 years. However, the ship commander who will command it takes 15 years. The commodore takes 20 years and the admiral takes 25 years. What if the naval power that emerged with such hard work is destroyed by unexpected attacks and losing important warships? Russia's in danger of losing its image in the seas. Let's take a look at the heavy blows that the Russian Navy took with the Ukrainian attacks. Ukrainian forces continue to be the nightmare of the Russian Navy with their successful missile launches. While Ukrainian missiles target Russian warships, the warships wait desperately for the attack. The commander of the armed forces of Ukraine released the images taken after the attack on a ship belonging to the Russian Black Sea Fleet. The clip was made public after the confession of a Russian admiral who for months denied that the Saratov warship had sunk. The commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine, Valery Zaluzhny, put the clip on his Telegram channel in which he said that a year ago, on March 24, 2022, the soldiers destroyed the ship in the port of Berdyansk. The Russian Navy landing ships Orsk, Caesar, Kunikov, and Novokherkassk were also damaged. However, Saratov did not survive the attack as easily as the other 3 ships. Saratov was blown up and destroyed as a result of successful attacks by Ukrainian forces. Valery Zaluzhny, commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine, underlined that the legend of the invincibility of the Russian fleet was destroyed by well-intentioned attacks. Also, the sinking of Saratov came just after Vladimir Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The incident occurred 3 weeks before the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, the cruiser Moskva, was destroyed in an attack that brought a PR blow to Ukraine, as it is known. On April 13, Ukraine's Neptune missiles struck and sank the Moskva cruiser worth $750 million. The cruiser Moskva drowned in the depths of the sea on April 14. As a result of this attack, the Russian Ministry of Defense openly acknowledged the death of only 5 crew members. But according to Alexei Danilov, Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, there were 510 personnel in Moscow at the time of the attack, of which 58 survived with the destruction of 4 warships in Berdyansk by Ukraine. The Russian Navy received another heavy blow. The blows that Ukraine inflicted on the Russian Navy revealed another reality. Ukraine will not stand still, neither on land nor in water, and will continue to move forward. Also, Russia acknowledged the loss of Saratov only on the first anniversary of the destruction of the ship when Felix Menkov, the commander of the Crimean naval base in Sevastopol, appointed by Russia, unveiled a plaque commemorating the killed sailors a year ago. The loss of the battleship Saratov was confirmed, according to a local news source in Crimea. The news source also reported that the crews of Saratov, Novokherkassk, and Caesar Kunikov were also lost. The media outlet noted that after a year of denial that the ships were hit by Ukrainian missiles, this is the first official confirmation that the ship was lost in battle. Meanwhile, U.S. company Maxar Technologies has released satellite images showing the destroyed ship's proximity to the attack's fueling facilities. According to a Ukrainian news source, the damaged ship was lifted and taken to Crimea for repairs. The Ukrainian news outlet also reported that the commanders of the 2 landing craft damaged in Berdyansk were traitors to Ukraine because they took refuge in Russia in 2014. While the Kremlin is shaken by the blowing up of the Russian Navy, the Kiev leader continues to intimidate Russia with his statements. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, in his speech to the graduates of the Odessa Maritime Academy, said that Russian ships already know what awaits them in Ukrainian waters. Also thanking the officers of the Ukrainian Navy for protecting the state in the naval defense sector, President Zelensky added that Ukraine needs victory at sea, on land, and in the air against the enemy. Vladimir Zelensky said that Russian ships have already memorized the only chance for themselves in Ukrainian waters. Russia's Black Sea flagship has already demonstrated what any ship threatening Ukraine will face, and it's only a matter of time before the Moscow ship repeats its fate. Our defense and security forces have proven conclusively that the Ukrainian Snake Island will not tolerate the enemy flag. And these, our dear Odessa graduates, are just 3 elements of the great naval war that is still going on the Maritime Academy. Emmy will participate and win. Also, Zelensky added, you really earn the right to lead this heroic crew. Our soldiers who bravely and extremely effectively defended Ukraine at sea against overwhelming enemy forces. Please always keep an eye on your soldiers, protect them, and Ukraine help all who fight alongside you against Russian evil. Protect freedom of navigation, one of the key elements of global security, and protect those who peacefully and legally use Ukrainian territorial waters. Finally, Zelensky appealed to the Academy authorities not to forgive the enemy for any crimes committed against Ukraine and its people. Ukraine continues to besiege the Russian army from 3 sides with its successes on land, in the air, and at sea. This success of Ukraine does not go unnoticed by many military analysts. Mick Ryan, a retired Major General in the Australian Army, said this week that the Ukrainian army is the best in the world in its ongoing war with Russia. In his statements, Ryan talked about the different aspects of the Ukrainian armed forces and how they use a range of capabilities in their wars against Russia, such as missile defense, drone defense, and frontline combat units. Ryan stated that the Ukrainian army is the best army in the world, according to Ryan. The Ukrainian army has proven in 13 months that it is the best army in the world. Ryan said that honestly, they've shed a lot of blood now to learn the many lessons they've learned. They lost a lot of young men and women, old men and women, but they are the best army in the world. We have a lot to learn from them. Also, Ryan consists of several elements of the Ukrainian army. According to him, the Ukrainian army has a regional defense force, a professional army consisting of veterans and newly mobilized soldiers. Ryan emphasized that there are many independent units in the Ukrainian army. Mark Kansian, a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies International Security Program, said that Ryan is absolutely right in emphasizing the human element in warfare, particularly training and leadership, and there is no doubt that the Ukrainians have more. On the other hand, Kansian continued to cite the different training received by the US military compared to the Ukrainian military, which received only 2 or 3 weeks of training before going to war. According to Kansian, every sailor recruit receives 22 weeks of training. The Ukrainians are sending 2 battalions through combat training in Europe. In a typical year, the US Army sends about 60 battalions to similar training. Kansian stated that most of the Ukrainian commanders are very skilled on the battlefield, but Kansian said Ukrainian commanders probably lack the depth of training necessary to perform complex joint maneuvers. The Ukrainian commanders, who allegedly did not have the necessary depth of training, have so far managed to inflict heavy damage on the Russian Navy. In summary, the Russian Black Sea Fleet, which was based jointly with the Ukrainian Navy in the Sevastopol port of Crimea until 2014, experienced significant returns in its conflicts with the Ukrainian naval forces. These range from the loss of the flagship Moskva by Ukrainian anti-ship missiles to Navy drones remotely commanded by Ukrainian personnel targeting Sevastopol. As the conflict enters its second year and Putin has repeatedly expressed his determination to achieve total victory, the Russian Navy's contribution to achieving this goal remains problematic. The performance of the Russian Navy during the special military operation was inadequate as the Russian army begins its second-year offensive on Ukraine. Putin, so fond of Russia's Soviet past, better ponder the impact of the prolonged military incapacity during the First World War on the 300-year-old Romanov dynasty in